Joining us from Canberra, Dr. Simon Jackman, the CEO of the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Simon Jackman, welcome back to the drum.
Thank you, good to be here.
So, was this a surprise that the US Senate, when it had these not vastly dissimilar bills from both sides, didn't pass any of them?
No, 60 votes is always a high bar to reach in the US Senate, and you think about the public opinion underlying those 60 votes, to actually get to 60, you're talking about, you need public opinion in the range of 65, probably 66%. And so although public opinion is certainly starting to turn in the United States on this issue, particularly in the wake of the tragedy in Orlando, we just weren't, and the current US Senate just isn't at that magic 60 vote number that you need to bring debate to an end and to call the question.
There was a fairly low bar being set, and it seemed for a time in the last week that Donald Trump was even in the process of talking to the National Rifle Association about whether at least banning people on the terror no-fly list should be prevented from getting guns. They couldn't even get that far, though.
No, and I mean, to Australian ears it sounds rather absurd, doesn't it? That people who are on a terrorist no-fly list, that their gun rights are still being protected by elements of the Republican Party in the US Senate, and a few Democrats too, by the way. As absurd as it sounds to us, it just speaks to the nature of the debate in the United States and what would even constitute small progress on that issue. Trump, on the other hand, quickly got back into line, though. I think at various points he's been flirting with making some progress on this issue, but the NRA had a word with him, it would seem, as he was having a word to them, and he's back in line on that issue for the time being.
Where does public opinion stand on these issues when it comes to certain categories of weapons, as well as the sort of the checks and balances around how quickly you can get things, the kind of background checks that you should have to go through and so on?
Yeah, look, on the coasts and in large cities, it's pretty much a settled question. That there ought to be gun control, that assault weapons are not things that private citizens ought to be possessing. But very quickly, once you get into rural and regional America, once you get into the southern states, and even parts of the Northeast and Appalachia, parts of, say, a state like New Hampshire, very interesting state on gun control, once you get away from the big cities, public opinion changes rather quickly, mirroring, frankly, to some extent, the dynamics of that issue in Australia, although we're talking at a much lower level in Australia. I think the way that issue tracks from city to bush is much the same in the two countries.
Let's bring in the panel for some questions and comments. Amelia Lester.
Yeah, look, I spent 15 years in the US, just coming back pretty recently, and I was constantly asked by Australians when, unfortunately, massacre after massacre occurred, why it was that Americans couldn't do anything about it. And far be it from me to explain a country of 350 million people, but I'm going to take a stab at it. I think the thing that Australians find hard to understand about the American relationship with guns is that they have a very real paranoia about government, which is a strange term to use. But if I was to psychoanalyze the nation, that's what it comes down to. The idea in America that you need to be able to protect yourself against the government is, I think, the motivating factor beneath all of this.
Simon, what do you think this idea, because there's also the thesis that says it's not just the government that is the enemy, which is why Americans cling to their guns, but also you can't ignore the issue of race, and that when a lot of white men who are typically gun owners think about threats to themselves and their families, they're thinking of black men, and that's a big part of this as well.
Yeah, John, I was going to go exactly there. I think that's a big part of the psychology around guns. I don't think it's a simple one recipe fits all. But I think what you identified, and I also think, you know, the founding myth of freedom in the United States and limited government, that's a piece of it as well. But it's a complicated issue, but there's a lot of forces pushing in the same direction towards this widespread acceptance of a very permissive regime with respect to guns. And indeed, as we saw in the Senate today in the United States, the idea that it's easier for a terrorist to get on a plane than it is harder for a terrorist to get onto a plane than it is for them to buy a gun, that just speaks to sort of how deep and how central this sort of the Second Amendment to the Constitution that enshrines it. You know, it's also got that about it as well. It's in the capital C Constitution. There's a reference to guns and gun ownership in the Constitution of the United States. So a lot of forces that push towards the direction of cementing gun ownership in the American psyche.
Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously it's a constitutional right and constitutions can be changed, but in the reading that I've done and the times that I've spent in America, what is interesting to me is the connection between gun ownership and a concept of citizenship. To be an American citizen, part of it is the right to have a gun. So almost kind of taking it away. I mean, part of that's connected to what Amelia says in terms of being able to have the ability to resist the government. But this kind of, in senses, there's negative parts of it, but there's quite positive parts of it as well. And we just don't have the same, we just do not have the same notion that Australian citizenship relies on owning a firearm. And that's, I think, why Australians just look at things like that, things that have happened, and the debate in America, particularly the argument of the way to solve the problem with guns is just for everybody to buy more guns. It's a little bit like the problems with democracy is to have more democracy without really realising, well, what's not working with the democratic system. But personally, when Sandy Hook happened, when all those children were killed and there was no movement, I thought, well, if
that's not gonna
all
do it,
those children can be killed by an American citizen, by a young American man, not by a terrorist, then if there's no movement after that, I wonder what will have to happen for there to be movement.
Just quickly, Simon Jackman, before we let you go, there is a case now, it's gone before the courts in the United States. A young British man in the United States apparently had an assassination attempt in mind against Donald Trump. He tried to take a gun off a security guard at a Trump rally in Las Vegas. Is that the kind of thing that could see movement on this if we get to that sort of level?
Oh, on the gun issue, no, I don't. Well, the assassination, if you will, of one of the nominees or one of the presumptive nominees, certainly. I mean, that would be a hammer blow, and it'd be only one death, but a very vivid one and a spectacular one and a horrible one, and one that I'm not really comfortable even contemplating. I think what we're more likely to see, and again, another tragedy, is that we will see these mass shootings are happening at a higher tempo more recently in the United States. These are no longer once every 2 or 3 years. These are now once every 6 months or so. And what I'm fearful of is that there'll be another mass casualty event between now and the election, and not because of its political consequences, just for the tragedy of the event itself. It seems to be that that's the only way progress is made on this issue, that the edifice of solidarity that the NRA has built with the Republican Party might begin to crack.